Ken's going to do a deep dive on SQL in Azure for us. We're going to unpack the differences between Azure Single Database, between Elastic Pools, managed instances, or running SQL on a virtual machine in Azure. We're going to talk about D2Us versus vCores. We understand this stuff's confusing. We're going to help you figure that stuff out. Go over the pricing and the licensing considerations, and then leave some time at the end for questions. So before jumping in there, just a little bit about Interlink. And a lot of what we try to do is really simplify, because we understand, that interacting with Microsoft can be complicated and not always easy. And a lot of that comes down to the licensing. And SQL Server is a place where Microsoft has made that licensing incredibly confusing. And when we start talking about how some of that stuff translates into Azure, it can get even more difficult. Interlink's got multiple certified licensing experts on staff, myself included. Yes, I'm a technical guy that went to the dark side and understood Microsoft licensing, but we help you go through and understand that so that you're buying the product the right way and you're maximizing the benefits of what you already own. All right, we're experienced. A lot of this comes back to our assessment process, so we can identify a lot of those challenges in advance before they impact the project. We're going to help you through some of those conversations to figure out how to do things the right way. Right, and we're going to remove risk by building security into each and every one of our projects. Right, when we go to the cloud, we have a lot of new capabilities from a security standpoint. We've also got a lot of things that change that we need to make sure that we're prepared for, organizationally before we start moving our data. And again, this comes back to making sure that we're going to go through and drive business value all the way through. And that means looking at the budgeting, the planning, and C-suite justification processes. And that means we're going to help you understand what the ROI is. And what we're seeing, more and more applications should move to the cloud, but not every single one of them should. Making sure that we understand what that cost justification looks like is a huge part of making sure that we're going to the cloud the right way. And again, we're not the Amazon experts, we are the Microsoft experts. It's what we specialize in, it's what we're good at. Every single one of our consultants holds certifications from Microsoft, and Ken is probably the most certified guy that I know with more than 38 Microsoft certifications. So enough about that. Let's start to jump in here. And this is a PowerPoint presentation, and this is Microsoft centric. So we've got to go through and have the requisite "the world is changing" slide with statistics. All right, so we see, what does that mean when the world is changing? And a lot of times what we're talking about is digital transformation. We're talking about, taking computers and using technology to drive change, okay, which is generating more data than we've ever seen before. Right, and so as we look at this, total amount of data that organizations are going to have to manage is going to grow to 44 zettabytes by 2020. So what's a zettabyte? Well, it's more than a petabyte, which is more than an exabyte, which is more than a terabyte, which is more than a gigabyte. Right, so we're talking about absolutely enormous quantities of data, which presents both a challenge and an opportunity for our organizations. So because of the sheer volume of data, right, building the systems to go through and manage and maintain that doesn't always make sense for one organization to do on their own. And so we're seeing that 80% of organizations are adopting a cloud-first strategy to help them manage and gain insights from their data. And artificial intelligence is all the rage. And I know this is something that we've been talking about for years and years at this point, but we're really starting to see the possibility of artificial intelligence come to fruition with some of these new cloud services. In fact, one of the best reasons to go ahead and move your data to Azure in general is that I've got AI capabilities that are built into the platform that I can take advantage of. And so we're seeing that artificial intelligence investment has increased by 300% year over year, just in calendar year 2017 alone. And when all of that stuff comes together, data, cloud, and AI, that's where the magic happens. Because we've got to go through and use the cloud to drive the scale that we need to go through and manage that data, and then AI to harness insights from it. And so what we're seeing there is that organizations that harness that data in the cloud and the AI, they outperform organizations that don't. Right, and it's really just night and day. Your big competitive advantage is how you can gain insights from your data. Right, and so Microsoft did a study with Keystone Research, and what they found here is that companies that were in the top quintile, that's the top fifth of organizations that invested in data and AI, ended up with nearly double the operating margin of companies that didn't. Now granted, I realize not every company on this that's part of this webinar that's kind of in that mid-market is going to generate 100 million in additional operating income, but that's the potential, right? That's the potential for growth, as we go through and can drive better decisions from our data. So what do these organizations have in common that's helping them excel? Well, when they go through and they look at their data platform, all right, they're building one version of the truth. Everyone needs to understand where the data came from. They need to understand what that means. And I can't have conflicting data in different parts of my environment, right? So building that single version of the truth is super important, because when I do that, I now get consistent metrics. So I can look at my data over time frames to try to understand what those trends look like. I can look year over year, I can look year to date, and I can understand that the data is always going to mean the same thing regardless of when I look at it, which leads to better comparisons, right? So between those time frames, I'm going to help understand and gain insights from it. And then I've got the tools that let me find trends. Some of them are going to be obvious, something I can go through and look at a data table or look at a pretty report and some of the visualizations that are in a tool like Power BI. In other cases, I can go through and use artificial intelligence to look for patterns that might be hidden in the data. And the cloud makes it super easy to go through and integrate third-party data. Almost all of the tools that we're going to talk about today have the ability to go through and integrate and pull in data from third-party data sources, right? And so I can go through and see the impact of other factors. One of the awesome examples that I've seen is the ability to build machine learning models that can pull in weather data so I can understand the impact of weather on my sales, right? Which is super important in terms of forecasting resources, which ultimately comes back to drive profitability. I mean, in the end, what we're seeing is that better data equals better decisions, equals better execution all the way throughout our business. So why cloud? Right, the challenge here, and this is where I said we've got both challenge and opportunity. So I've got a lot of different use cases that I have to be able to go through and cover in order to do this the right way, right? So I've still got to go through and support my online transaction processing systems, my line of business applications that my users are working in from a day-to-day basis, right? I've got to have a data warehouse or multiple data marts that let me go through and report off of that data effectively. I have to be able to support analytics. Can I create predictive models? Can I create what-if scenarios, okay, to work to glean insights from my data? And then a lot of times we've got other unstructured data that we need to go through and store long-term. So we need options for cold data that we only access periodically, hot data that I need online for real time, and then warm data that falls someplace in between. And then I want different price models that let me go through and do those in a cost-effective way. And more, we're seeing streaming and real-time analytics become super important, right? So this could be as simple as monitoring a Twitter feed and then taking actions off of the data that comes through that, or it could be on the manufacturing shop floor, where I've got telemetry data around my manufacturing process that I want to go through and keep track of, so I can make sure that my assembly line is operating at maximum efficiency. So I've got tools in Azure that let me go through and cover that. And then unstructured data. So we've got massive quantities of data that are coming in for all different data sources, and I need a place to go through and store that I can query and gain insights. I've got that capability in Azure, which is fantastic. So when we go through and we start to move to the cloud, one of the things that are awesome about this is that we're going to go through and we're going to provision computing, networking, and storage, and we're going to pay for only what we need. Right, so I don't have to go out and lay out the cost investment to buy this stuff up front. All of this stuff is there for us inside of Microsoft's data centers, more than 43 across the world at this point. So I've got data centers that are going to be available in every geography that I need. And I'm going to have security and management that goes with that. So when we start to look at what these solutions look like, I think we're all comfortable with what a traditional on-premise model looks like, right? And this is where we're really trying to go through, and we're managing everything end to end. Right, so from the application all the way down to the underlying hardware, the servers, the storage, and the networking that my systems run on. Right, so at that point, we're paying people to take care of the underlying infrastructure to keep the lights on. Where we're really trying to go is to start to move up the chain so we can focus on the things that drive more business value. Keeping a server network is super important because of the applications that run on top of it, but in the end, it's the application that ultimately drives the productivity. Right, so infrastructure as a service, lets a vendor take care of some of that underlying hardware for us. So they take care of the virtualization, the servers, the storage, the network, and that could be a traditional colocation provider. That could be Azure letting us just provision a virtual machine and then installing what we want over the top of it. All right, platform as a service lets us get even more focused on the things that are important for the business, because at this point, I'm taking away the operating system. I don't have to go through and manage that. I don't have to keep it up to date. I don't have to keep it secure. Microsoft does that for me. And so when we start talking about Azure SQL, this is where we really want to get to. right? So Microsoft can provision either a single database or an instance of SQL, and that's all I have to worry about. That's kept up to date for me. It's secured, it's optimized, right? Fantastic stuff. And then in some cases, we're still going to look at software as a service, not really where we're focused from a conversation standpoint today, but just wanted to go through and show it for completion. And this is where things like Office 365 lived, where I get email as a service, file sharing as a service through OneDrive, where things like Salesforce offers CRM as a service for us. So when we start to look to move to the cloud, all right, a lot of times, we're going to go through and pick off different software as a service apps, and we're going to replace our existing applications with those. So it could be migrating email out to Exchange Online and decommissioning my on-premise Exchange environment. But after that, I've got these other applications, these databases, these things that my users are taking advantage of on a daily basis that we want to move to the cloud. We want to get our data close to those services in Azure that let us harness and glean those insights from it. So a lot of times, the first step for organizations is going to be a lift and shift. Right, it takes time to go through and modernize my applications and re-architect them. So we're going to go through and migrate those existing virtual machines up to the cloud. They're still going to run as virtual machines, and so now I'm close to some of those other services, but it's not forcing me to go through and re-architect my applications. I've got time to go through and get that done. But ultimately, that's the potential that we unlock, is the ability to modernize the way that we develop applications. So then we can refactor, re-architect, and rebuild. Okay, and the scenario that we really want to get to is to get to a serverless architecture where I can deploy an application that runs its code on Azure Application Services. I connect to a database that's running on Azure SQL. I can go through and use things like Azure Stream Analytics to pull in some of that real-time data that we talked about. I've got security services that sit over the top of that, and I can deploy an application end-to-end without having to touch a single server. Okay, incredibly powerful stuff that's available for us in Azure. So a few other reasons that we're seeing customers go through and move, the consistency of infrastructure is super important. A lot of times here, I can go through and I can invest and I can build a very robust data center environment, but every time we go through and do that as an individual organization, we're having to repeat, some of those things and do them over and over. Every organization has to have the redundancy, in terms of battery backup. I've got to have generators. I've got to have the high-powered and redundant cooling units. I've got to build extra servers, extra storage, and every single company has to make that investment, right? So we can do that, but in the end, when Microsoft has the opportunity to do that at scale, I get a guaranteed SLA that goes along with that platform, and I don't have to do it myself, which means it's typically going to be lower cost. And what we're seeing with most organizations is that when they move to Azure, they're getting a higher level of reliability that they can drive from their current on-premise environment. And this gets us out of the hardware business. No more hardware management. Lets me go through and take my IT staff and refocus them on the things that are more important to my business. The predictable cost and performance is super important as well. A lot of times, if we've got spare capacity in our on-premise environment, when we go through and deploy an application, it's hard for us to understand what it actually costs to run that application in our environment. We can go through and over provision a virtual machine, allocate more resources to it than it really needs, and it really doesn't matter, right? It's hard for me to go through and identify what slice of that virtual environment is ultimately dedicated to that application. But when I take that application and I lift it up to the cloud, right, I get to understand exactly what it costs. I pay for only what I need, exactly when I need it, and I can go through and apply tags from a cost management standpoint that let me go through and tie together the individual components of an application. So we've seen some customers get some huge benefit by being able to go back to the business and say, here's exactly what this application costs us to run in our environment. And by the way, we're going to go through and charge it back to you, which is going to force you to be efficient in terms of how you use it, and make sure that there's an ROI to have it in place at all. Some awesome stuff that goes with that. And security and compliance is a huge driver. And honestly, I've seen a big shift in the market over the last few years as security has become something that's just not optional anymore. And a lot of that are new compliance requirements, GDPR, European General Data Privacy Regulations, that went into effect in May of this year. But even so, it could be things like Sarbanes-Oxley, it could be things like HIPAA, SOC compliance, that are driving us to move to the cloud. Because when I move my data into the cloud, I may still have to flip the right switches and turn the right dials to make sure I'm configuring things correctly, but I'm inheriting Microsoft's data center certifications. They've already done the work to achieve that compliance, so it's not something that I have to go back and reinvent the wheel as part of. Azure is also going to have some unique security services that are available. So something like Azure SQL Advanced Threat Protection that lets me go through and put protection, real-time protection on connections to that database that are going to block things like SQL injection attacks on the Azure platform that are available only on Azure. And I've got robust support for third-party integrations. Microsoft's got a wide ecosystem of partners that are developing for the Azure platform. So I can deploy solutions from Trend Micro, from Palo Alto, from FortiGate, from Cisco, and put things like firewalls, web application firewalls in front of my applications in order to protect them. Lots of options to drive additional security for my applications that may not be as easy to deploy as in my on-premise environments. And from a data center certification standpoint, I mentioned just a few of those, but Microsoft's already taken the time to become HIPAA certified or HIPAA compliant. So if I have, protected data that I want to put into the cloud, Microsoft will sign a HIPAA BAA, Business Associate Agreement, with you. If I've got data in European operations, Germany is one of the most restrictive countries in the world when it comes to data residency. I've got Azure data centers that are in Germany that are compliant with Germany's data center certifications, right? So again, I benefit from the fact that Microsoft has already gone down this path, and I can ensure compliance by putting my data inside of Azure. So with that, hopefully I generated just a little bit of interest at this point. Now I'm going to turn it over to Ken Kruthop to talk a little bit about SQL Server and Azure, infrastructure versus PaaS, and the pros and the cons.
Great, thanks, Mike. So let's take a look then specifically at IaaS versus PaaS in the SQL Azure environment, but we'll spend the majority of our time here in the PaaS solution. The IaaS solution, as Mike has already alluded to a couple times, is truly the infrastructure as a service. You can think about that as a VM in somebody else's data center. That is 100%, you have the operating system in control, you install your version of SQL Server, and whatever functions you are running in-house, you simply have extended your network to someone else's data center. Whereas the PaaS environment is the platform as a service. There are several things we need to talk about in the platform as a service, and those specifically will be running a single database, running something called an elastic pool, or something new that Microsoft called the managed instance. So when we began building SQL servers in our environment, the SQL Server was installed on a physical server. In order to start that application, we had to go out and purchase hardware. And that hardware, we went out and bought a HP DL580, may have cost $100,000, $200,000, depending on how you configured it. And if you wanted redundancy with that, then you had to double that cost. So before we started the project, we may have been $250,000 or $500,000 into the project for just purchasing the hardware. Then we decided we could virtualize that environment. At first, in the Microsoft world, we couldn't virtualize SQL Server because SQL Server consumed all the resources, but we found a way to do that. And now in Hyper-V or VMware, we could virtualize that environment on-prem. So Microsoft gives us the ability to continue that VM environment in the cloud with the IaaS server as we just spoke about. Again, think about that as a VM in somebody else's data center. We've simply extended our network. And then the PaaS solution, the platform as a service, that gives us the ability to have Microsoft in the Azure environment manage the server, manage the backups, a lot of the automation that we typically manage today on-prem. So as we move away from the physical environment to the PaaS solution, we get shared lower cost and we get lower administration. In the Azure Relational Database Platform, we have lots of tools that we can use in that platform. Power BI. Power BI is designed to run in the Azure platform. We have Azure App Services, the Azure Data Factory. The Azure Data Factory is designed to replace SSIS in the Azure platform. We have Azure Analysis Services, machine learning driving us towards artificial intelligence, the cognitive services, and now Azure Bot Services. With that environment, we can run SQL databases. We can build a SQL data warehouse. We have the ability to install PostgreSQL, MySQL, and Maria databases for intelligent, flexible, trusted solutions on the database platform. Some of the key benefits of Azure SQL Database would be independent scale compute and storage to match both the performance and the financial needs. So if our application needs to run at a very high performance level from 7:30 in the morning till 6 o'clock at night. And that high performance for us requires 8 cores, 128 gigs of RAM. We can choose that. At 6 o'clock in the evening, we can have a PowerShell script that says, hey, no longer do we need that much processing power because we pay by the hour. We can turn that down to maybe 2 cores. Maybe we're just going to do some bulk loading of data that we don't care if it takes 2 or 3 hours to run, but in the evenings, we don't need 8 cores. And so we can turn it down to 2 cores and 32 gigs of RAM, let that bulk load take a while, and we save significant money by doing that. Highly available, 99.99% uptime, availability, active geo-replication, and they've given us the ability to do point-in-time restore. We have another feature of 100 times performance with in-memory column stores. So if we can choose our data to use the in-memory column stores, we can get much faster performance. Improved monitoring and troubleshooting, up to 100 more table views have been created to help us monitor that event. And support for some programmability functions to drive more robust application features. Easy for me to say anyway. Some 2017 updates that have been added to the SQL database. As SQL Server has migrated to the Azure platform, they've migrated as much as they can, as quickly as they can, but they continue to add more features. Some of those features we see as the automatic tuning with the learn and adapt. We have the ability for the privacy and trust to actually have always encrypted, no longer with TDE when we encrypted data at rest, but we now have the always encrypted. We have the ability to have HADR built in. We don't have to create those additional replicas for us. So a lot of things that the Microsoft world built on-prem is now highly available and becoming available in the Azure SQL database environment. So it allows us to focus on our business as opposed to focusing on, for example, the hardware purchasing and management. With PaaS, allows us the ability to built-in scale on demand, and it provides us with the point-in-time restores where in the past, we backed up our data, we performed our backups to disk, we copied them to tape, we stored them off-site. It's all taken care of for us. We don't have to worry about that. A lot of these features are just built in. They're easy to use. Updates are automatic. Tuning and maintenance are predictable, easy features that are taken care of for us. So with PaaS, the point-in-time recovery, the way that works, point-in-time restore, I think they made an acronym out of that, PITR. And that point-in-time restore is capable because in the Azure environment, we back up the logs every 5 minutes. And it's dynamic. We can't go in and remove that. We have tiered retention policies. If you choose the basic tier with using DTUs, you get 7 days. But if you go to the standard and premium, you get 35 days of built-in retention. And we see our little graphic that shows us how that might work. In the self-managed environment, it's built-in maintenance. Removes virtually all infrastructure maintenance from the Azure SQL database platform. Provide automatic patching as part of the service. No longer have to worry about, do we patch on the cycle of the primary or the secondary, and it's fault tolerant. Allows system replicas to automatically move should a machine fail. When SQL Server first moved to the PaaS environment, we could only choose SQL logins. That caused an issue. Microsoft listened. That they allow us now to use Azure Active Directory authentication. With Azure Active Directory authentication, we can synchronize our on-prem Active Directory users that need access to our SQL Server environment and provide them with Windows integrated logins inside SQL Server, allowing us to limit the proliferation of users' identities across databases, allowing password rotation to be stored in a single place, enables management of database permissions by using external Azure Active Directory groups, and eliminates the need to store additional passwords. So it's a great feature, allowing us to have the integrated security now. So the Microsoft Azure SQL Data Platform, we have SQL Database, elastic pools. We have the Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, which is a fairly new thing, maybe the last 2 months, and the Azure Virtual Machine, which is our IaaS SQL Server. So the best use of using an elastic pool or single database is new cloud design. If we have an application that we want to move from our on-prem to the SQL PaaS environment, today we want to choose the managed instance. That allows the most features of on-premises, instant levels, and database capable levels. With both SQL Server database and elastic pool and managed instance, it allows us to employ IT resources for configuration management of the underlying infrastructure. It also allows us to eliminate hardware cost and reduces administrative cost. For the Azure Virtual Machine and IaaS, we think of that as a server that resides in someone else's data center. It eliminates the startup hardware cost, but I still get to manage that fully, and I have every feature that was available online or on-premise for me. So looking to the SQL Server database deployment, which should I choose? So we talked about the single, the elastic pool, and the managed instance. If I choose single and choosing the Azure SQL database, I'm saying when I choose that, and if I choose 4 cores and 32 gigs of RAM, then I am dedicating 4 cores and 32 gigs of RAM to that database. If I add an additional database to that instance, which I can, that instance is now 2 single databases where each one has dedicated access to 4 cores and 32 gigs of RAM, therefore doubling my cost. If I need to have many databases running in the Azure environment in a single instance, I can choose an elastic pool. In fact, with the elastic pool, you can choose from 50 to 500 databases in the elastic pool, but you now share those resources. So if I choose to share 8 processors and 128 gigs of RAM, I am sharing those resources. That doesn't mean that the databases can interact together in the elastic pool because they have some issues with the ability to cross database queries. If I need that capability, I want to choose the managed instance. The managed instance allows cross-database platform. It allows us to assign linked servers. It allows lots of other features that we'll take a look at. But the managed instance really is the cross-database platform on the PaaS solution that we'd want to choose today. So we pay for what we need. Microsoft originally set up the environment to create DTUs, data transaction units. And in those data transaction units, we began with basic needs, which are very small databases. In fact, only 2 gigabytes that we'll see in a minute, or standard or premium. The higher we went, the more redundancy and highly available options that I had. But in today's world, we want to be able to use vCores too. Microsoft has heard that. In vCores, the function allows us to actually use the hybrid use benefit, which Mike will talk about in detail in a little bit, but brings that licensing from our on-prem to the Azure SQL platform. With that, I can choose general purpose or business critical. And as you can imagine with business critical, faster I/O, higher availability requirements, read-only tiers, all available on that platform. So the DTU versus the core conversation. Database transaction units were prepackaged bundles that were supposed to represent database power. We had to figure out if I chose 1,000 DTUs, how many cores would that be? Because on-prem, I always chose cores when I set up my environment. I didn't choose something called a DTU, and it was a difficult sizing requirement. The vCore allows us to choose that a la carte approach that deconstructs that DTU. I can say, hey, I needed 8 cores on-prem, I need 8 cores in the cloud. No longer, though, in the PaaS environment, do I need to worry about managing the operating system, managing the memory, those sorts of things. This vCore model is specifically designed for the PaaS SQL environment. It allows us to right-size the compute requirements in the cloud. In a DTU-based single services tier, as we said, the basic is designed for very light transactional workloads with 2 gigabytes of max data size. where the standard can go from 250 gigabytes to 1 terabyte, and the premium up to 4 terabytes of database size. The security has up to 4 readable secondary backups and is active geo-replication, and we can support up to 4,000 database transaction units on the premium side. In choosing the vCore model as opposed to DTUs, I would then choose either general purpose or business critical. Both general purpose and business critical, I can choose Gen 4 or Gen 5 compute tiers. In that, with the Gen 4, I can have up to 72 cores, and in the Gen 5, I can have up to 80 cores. With Gen 5, I can have super fast local SSD storage and extremely quick response time. And I can use, on the Gen 5, I can get up to 4 terabytes of storage per managed instance. The Gen 5 also provides with a readable scale, read scale instance in our highly available environment, which allows us to have a reporting structure that is separate from our OLTP environment, which is a very powerful feature for a lot of our customers. So the Gen 4 vCore Singleton Services tier, as we said, general purpose versus business critical. We see that we can have for general purpose up to 168 gigs of RAM, the same as with the business critical, up to 24 cores. With the business critical, I am getting the additional replicas. I am getting the 1 read scale and zone redundant HA, and we see up to 120,000 IOPS, which is very high power processing. And with the Gen 5, which is the Broadwell processor, we can now have up to 80 cores and 440 gigs of RAM, 3 replicas in the HA environment with the 1 read scale, zone redundant, and 200,000 IOPS, which we're really getting up there in the processing. So what is the SQL database managed instance? The goal here was to make it as transparent as possible from our on-prem. It's designed to be an easily lift and shift to a platform as a service environment. It's built on the same PaaS service as infrastructure and has all the PaaS features that we had before, and we have some additional features that are available for us. Some of those features that we were missing when we originally went to the single or the elastic platform was the native backup and restore, the TDE and always encrypted features for security, row level security, dynamic data masking, all available in a managed instance. Cross-database queries and transactions with linked servers available today in a managed instance, which again is very powerful when I'm having multiple databases in that instance. I also have the ability to have the SQL agent as part of that PaaS solution using the query store, available with database mail, service brokers, change data capture, and other additional features that we used to have on-prem that just weren't there before are now available in that managed services tier. So with that, I'd like to turn this back over to Mike. Yes, Mike?
Ken, I've actually got a couple of questions that related just to those conversations. Let me go through those for you real quick, if you could. And again, reminder, if you have additional questions, please feel free to go through and ask them in the chat window. Want to make sure that we're getting you the information that you need. But the first one was specific to data migration, right? So you already answered part of the question around native backup and restore being capable in inside of the Azure SQL Managed Instance. But how do I migrate data when I'm not using Managed Instance if I want to get out to Azure SQL itself?
That's a great question, because it's not as simple as we used to just do a backup and restore. We would disconnect and reconnect it. But today, and you got the SQL Server on-prem, you got a task, you see a deploy option that says deploy to Azure. And the reason why it's there is because it actually goes through and does some checks to make sure that you don't have some incompatible features in your on-prem database. So it's a great tool. So we actually deploy from Management Studio.
Okay, what versions of SQL are that supported from?
That's from 2008 R2 and greater. Originally wasn't out there in 2008 R2, but was added with some hot fixes and service packs.
Okay, no, awesome. Appreciate that one. The second question that I have is what's really different in a managed instance versus SQL? So I think you addressed part of that, and again, the lack of or SQL Server agent in the SQL database or SQL Elastic pools was kind of an issue. So that was brought forward in a managed instance. Are there any other key differences that people should worry about before moving?
So with the managed instance, there are some features that aren't available today that are being worked on. Transactional replication is available, but there's some things you just can't do inside of transactional replication, which I'd be happy to discuss in greater detail because it gets down to the nuts and bolts there. SQL Server Agent, some of those things we should be using more in the modern data state with the Azure Data Factory, but SQL Server Agent is available. There are just some features inside of each of those tools that aren't readily available today.
Okay, no, fair enough. And I think it's important to call out just as part of this that Microsoft with their general approach to making things cloud ready first, is really something that we're starting to see with Azure SQL going forward. In the end, when Microsoft rolled out Office 365 initially, some of the services, I were actually missing some features versus what I had in the on-premise environment. Pretty quickly, Microsoft worked to get those up to speed, and now 100% of their development is cloud first. And some of those features might make it into the next versions of the products that roll out on-prem. So a lot of the effort that we've seen from Microsoft over the last year is getting Azure SQL up to date from a feature and functionality standpoint. And you're going to see new features and functionality built into the Azure platform first, and then maybe coming back into the on-premise environment going forward.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt there, Mike, but I completely agree with that. One of those features that I just absolutely love is the ability to scale up and then back down without a restart of the VM in the PaaS environment. That is huge that we cannot do on-prem today.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Anything to add before I take over and dig into everyone's favorite topic, licensing and pricing?
Well, I'm not sure that's true, but it's all yours.
All right, sounds good. So all this awesome technology that Ken talked about today, what does it cost? All right, so let's start by looking at Azure SQL single database. Right, and so I hate this table because I think it's super confusing. There's too many columns, right? Because the answer is the typical consulting answer. So if I want to deploy a database that requires 2 cores and 14 gigs of memory, what does it cost? Well, it depends. Right, so if I don't do anything else, the most expensive way to buy this is to go put my credit card onto the portal on Azure, spin up an Azure subscription, and then spin up an Azure SQL database. And if I do that, I'm going to pay $368.19 per month to run that particular database in Azure or an Elastic pool as well. All right, but we've got a lot of opportunities to go do cost savings. And so when we see customers do this ROI analysis and try to understand what Azure costs, it definitely helps to have a partner who can help you walk through and see if some of those scenarios apply to you. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the Azure hybrid use benefit, but this is something that's only going to apply to the vCore model as part of that, but it's a way for me to bring my own SQL license into Azure. So we can see that when we buy a service on Azure, we're paying for the cost of the licensing and the cost of the compute. So when we bring our own license into Azure, we're only paying for that compute. So that same 2 core and 14 gigs of memory database drops from $368 down to $222. It's a 40% reduction by itself. I've also got the ability to do reserved instances. Now, this is something that was previously only available for virtual machines. We can now do this with Azure SQL Database and SQL Elastic pools, but this is making a commitment that I'm going to run this on the Microsoft platform. I'm going to prepay for a year, and in return, Microsoft's going to give me a discount, or I can prepay for 3 years and get an even bigger discount for doing that. And when I go through and I make that commitment, Microsoft, goes through and they can plan capacity on their platform more efficiently. So they're going to return that cost savings back to us in the form of a discount, which is awesome. And again, this is something where Microsoft is going to give you some flexibility. So I can exchange one reserved instance for another. And as long as I'm exchanging it for something that I would pay more, there's no penalty for me doing that. So if I start off and prepay for 2 cores and 14 gigs of memory, I can exchange that for a 4 core and 28 gigs of memory at no penalty at all. And if I do end up going down to a lower price model, the penalty is minimal, where I'm going to pay 12% of that remaining cost. Cost differential going forward. But when I combined a 3-year reserved instance with the Azure hybrid benefit as well, I'm gonna go through and drop that all the way down to $100 per month. So a 73% reduction from the list price on that. Fantastic stuff. So the managed instance pricing is going to be fairly similar as well. We're going to go through and price it on a vCore and memory. The main thing to take away from this is that I'm getting an entire instance of SQL, right? And so I'm going to be able to go through and provision as many databases as I want as part of that. This is our Gen 4 pricing in that scenario. I don't have the ability to do reserved instances. Those are something that's going to be coming soon. But again, that hybrid benefit makes an enormous difference in the overall pricing. If I can bring my own license, that's an awesome scenario. So an 8-core, 56 gig of memory drops from $1,472 down to $888 per month. 40% reduction for bringing my own license into Azure. And I think most of our customers are going to own SQL and be in that scenario. So when I go through and I provision the SQL database in Azure, I'm paying for the compute and I'm paying for the storage in the vCore model, right? And again, that's where Microsoft's still providing the DTU model for the time being, but everything is moving towards vCore going forward. So with the storage, I'm going to go through and pay for the database itself, the storage that we consume by provisioning those databases. General purpose, it's going to cost me 11.5 cents per gig per month to host that database. Business critical, which is going to have the super fast premium solid state storage, as part of that's going to be priced at 25 cents per gig per month. And from a backup standpoint, I've got both short-term and long-term retention to consider. My short-term backups, I'm going to have, my initial anything up to 35 days that are kind of built into the service as part of that. I get one free, well, not free, it's built into the cost of the service, but no additional charge. One free copy of the database, right? One full backup as part of that. So as I go through and make some of those additional transaction log backups and I have additional restore points, okay, that's going to be priced out at 10 cents per gig per month. So when we try to figure out what it's going to cost me to run things in Azure, it's important to look at what the rate of change on the data is in that particular database. The more frequently that it changes, the more additional data and transaction logs we're going to generate, and ultimately the more cost for that particular backup. And if I want to do longer term data retention, so if I want to get beyond that 35 days where I can do point in time restores, I can keep as many copies as I want, but they're going to be charged at 5.2 cents per gig per month to go through and retain those full copies going forward. Right, so pretty cost effective if I want to have multiple beyond that kind of initial 35 days of retention. So now let's dig into the Azure hybrid benefit, right? Because this is phenomenal value and a great way to make Azure more cost effective. So the way that this works, most of the customers are going to start looking at Azure, already going to own SQL licensing kind of going in. And as part of it, so we want to do an inventory of our on-premise licenses so we can understand what we have to convert. All right, so the main thing here is I have to have software assurance on those SQL licenses to be eligible for the Azure hybrid benefit. But when I do that, I can convert my on-premise cores, right, and bring those licenses directly into Azure. All right, so one SQL Server standard license with software assurance translates into a single general purpose vCore. An enterprise license, okay, SQL Enterprise Edition with software assurance translates into a business critical core or 4 general purpose cores. So when you look at the cost reduction that we see that goes along with this, a lot of organizations that we see the strategy here is that I'm going to go through and maintain software assurance longer term. I've already bought the license, right? I just pay software assurance to go through and maintain that kind of up-to-date version of it, that licensing mobility as well, right? And that, instead of paying for the cost of the license as part of Azure SQL, software assurance is going to be less expensive to go through and maintain. So it's an awesome benefit to go through and do that. And Microsoft helps us with the transition into Azure by being able to go through and run that license in the same or in 2 different places for 180 days. So while I'm in that migration phase, while I'm spinning things up, while I'm testing, while I'm migrating data, I can run that license on-prem and in the cloud for 180 days. Fantastic stuff. One of the few scenarios where Microsoft lets you go through and run a workload under the same license in 2 different places at once. So what does that mean? Microsoft calculates the ROI of moving to Azure SQL 406% over 5 years, right? An average payback period of 8.6 months going forward. right? So huge benefits to go through and move into Azure SQL, taking advantage of all of the reduction in management costs, the simplicity of the platform, and the speed with which you can go through and provision things when you need it. So all of this stuff, the main thing is assessing the environment before we go through and we move, so that we understand how to do this the right way, how to price it out the right way. This is something Interlink can definitely help with. So our model for assessing your environment is called the Path to Azure Data Center Planning. So we're going to go through and look at the 7 questions you need to look at your environment before deciding to go through and move your workload to Azure. But the main thing is taking a look at where the return on investment comes from, right? So where we can go through and do discounting opportunities, using things like reserved instances and hybrid use, scale up and scale down, intelligently to make sure that we're only paying for the resources that we need. Again, we can over provision in a traditional on-premise environment without impact, at least until I run out of resources. But in Azure, if I over provision, I pay for it. So we definitely want to make sure that we're sizing things appropriately as part of it. But we look for the places where we get the direct cost avoidance, where I'm not making that investment otherwise. And a lot of times, we're looking at the indirect benefits as well, where again, where can I, go through and save on, some of those soft costs. Maybe I have a preference to be able to move towards OpEx instead of CapEx, so that I'm smoothing out my cash flows. So some nice, benefits that go along with it as part of that. And a lot of times, and this is hard to quantify here, but I want to go through and point it out because I think it's important, is that sometimes if I want to go through and spin up a proof of concept real fast, I can go through and do that on Azure, and I can have something up and running in just a couple of hours, and I can do so without having to make an upfront investment. So if I've got an idea for an application that I think might be helpful for the business, I can go try it out, and my risk is really low because I'm not making a long-term commitment by spinning it up in the cloud. If it works, fantastic, we scale it up. If it doesn't work, we spin it down, we stop paying for it. Not something I can do in an on-premise environment, which is huge. And so for doing some of this work around assessing your environment, Microsoft is running an active program called Azure Everywhere, right, where we've got 2 sides of this funding, one on the assessment side to go through and run proof of concepts, architectural design sessions, and then I've also got this on the deployment side. Now, the amount of funding that's available is going to be tied directly to, what Microsoft estimates your monthly consumption of Azure is going to look like, but that can be up to $15,000 in some scenarios, to try to offset that cost. What Microsoft's really trying to do here as part of this is make it easy for you to consider Azure as a platform and understand how to do this the right way going forward. And this is something that, Interlink, we've been a leader in Microsoft funding utilization over and over. We'd love to go through and